What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Risen 3, the 6th game from Piranha Bytes and the final game in the Risen series that released back in 2014. Risen 3 is a title that somewhat combines the elements of both the first and second game in the series to comprise the final entry, and in some ways I think that worked out, and in others I think the game honestly lets you down a little bit. But before we dive into all that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that, so if you're curious about everything that I cover, there's a video linked in the description below. If you're not subscribed and go to my channel, it's also the first video that you'll see, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Though on the topic of achievements, in the case of Risen 3, they are all actually working. Just this year, actually, in 2023, Risen 1 was given achievements, but both Risen 1 and Risen 2 actually have problems with the achievement trackers and the fact that they'll reset on you if you exit the game, which means more tedious stuff like killing a certain amount of monsters has to be done in one go. But luckily, all of that is not the case for Risen 3. Everything's working as it should, which makes the only real tedious achievements in this case are getting the ones for maxing out your stats, but with a little bit of prep work, even those aren't so bad. Last but not least, before we dive fully into this though, do keep in mind that with this being the third entry in the series, it's almost impossible to talk about this game without spoiling a little bit of the first and second title, so do bear that in mind. However, at its core, I would say Risen 3 is very much so a Piranha Bytes game, whereas Risen 2 felt very different from everything they'd done previously. Risen 3 is much more of a return to form in terms of the structure of the title, and while the exact coat of paint might change, Risen 3 is more in line with what you'd expect from the studio. However, it combines a lot of the elements from both the first and second game. Where the first game was very reminiscent of the Gothic series, or at least 1 and 2, Risen 2 took that in a very different direction with different progression systems as well as different mechanics with things like guns being added, and Risen 3 seeks to combine those things, and in some ways I think that works and in other ways not so much. And we'll be breaking all of that down here, but we're going to kick this off with the story, of course. However, I am sad to report that Risen 3's story, in my opinion, is the weakest part of the game, because it kind of fails to provide a satisfying conclusion to the series as a whole, as well as this individual game. Some of this is down to the fact that we are no longer playing the same character from the first two titles. Rather, we are playing the son of Steelbeard, or at least one of his sons, as he's known to have many kids. Steelbeard was a recurring character, or at least he was mentioned in the first game, from the previous two entries. Patty, a recurring character that is in all three games, is his daughter, so in this game we play as her brother. So already we're playing an entirely different character for seemingly no reason, to be honest, because the game kicks off with you and Patty doing what pirates do and plundering the coast, more specifically looking into an ancient ruins. However, upon finding it, shadow creatures and undead start spilling forth, and our character is actually killed right at the beginning. However, shortly after, we are resurrected by a voodoo pirate known as Bones, another recurring character. Bones explains to us that our spirit is damaged by this, and if we act inhuman, we will slowly over time become inhuman, which means we need to be reunited with our soul, so to speak, before we turn into a demon. And the rest of the game from there revolves around gathering power and an alliance with all sorts of factions across various islands to combat the undead and shadowy threat to ultimately win your spirit back. Now, as the full title of the game, Risen 3 Titan Lords, and having played the other two games as well, might clue you in on the fact that the person behind all of this stuff is in fact a Titan Lord. But while that's a decent enough setup, I think it fails on a few fronts. For starters, the game has a soul mechanic, as it calls it, where you can either be good to people and earn soul, or you can be awful to people, which will diminish your soul rating. And based on your soul rating at the end of the game, you can earn one of two different endings. However, these endings mostly don't matter. It's an incredibly minor difference, and the impact on the rest of the game is mostly how you're speaking to other people. So while it's not completely insignificant, the endings that are are involved with it pretty much are, but even on that front, we don't get a satisfying conclusion to the rest of the series, because the rest of the series has set up all of these fights between Titan Lords and how it's destroying the planet and humanity is just trying to survive. But at the end of this, we don't know if this is the final Titan Lord and if humanity is safe or, has to have more fighting to happen, but this is the end of the series and we never get that answer. We don't know what happens to any of the characters. The game just kind of abruptly ends after the last boss with little to no fanfare, which is just not a good way to send off a series in my opinion. But even more than that, we're also kind of left with a very ambiguous ending for our previous hero. While that hero does make an appearance in Risen 3, it's incredibly minor and we're basically told that he's fine and continuing the fight, basically, but that's about it. So all in all, while I think the story is serviceable, it's kind of disappointing when you look at it in terms of the rest of the Risen series. But from there, I want to talk about some of the progression systems at play, because as I mentioned, this is a mix of 1 and 2, with the overall system being more in line with 2. However, some of the mechanics and things you could do from Risen 1 have made a reappearance. But ultimately, progression is down to things like attributes, their derivative skills, the abilities you can learn from trainers, as well as your equipment and collections. So at a base level, when we kill things, we will be gaining glory, which is the same as when you complete quests as well, and we can spend this glory on upgrading our various individual attributes. They've increased the number of attributes here from 5 to 8, which is mostly to accommodate the new things you can do, or the return of things you can do, I suppose. But ultimately, you can raise these attributes up and get better at the derivative stats as you go, which includes things like your various types of combat, but also more non-combat things such as lockpicking, pickpocketing, etc. All in all, you will be able to, without min-maxing, raise at least a few of these to their maximum, or as high as you'll ever need to go anyway, which is 100. Now, in terms of skill checks, the derivative skills cap out at 120. The highest skill check you'll see in the game is 120, which you'll reach with a combination of your attribute as well as skills or your collections. But our derivative stats are mostly the same as the previous games, with the addition of things like magic to adjust our ability with the various types of magic we'll have to use, or things like spirit, which adjust our ability with our astral vision, though we'll get to that a bit later. Across the game world, though, we can find various trainers who can teach us even more specific abilities. In order to learn these, we have to pay the trainer, as well as have minimums in certain attributes, in some case multiple, but this will allow you to learn to do more interesting things, such as parry and counterattack in melee combat, or simply more passive things like increasing damage, and most of your individual skills have a sort of capstone ability. Once you reach 100, if you can find the appropriate trainer, you can learn an especially strong ability for that is usually just a really strong passive. For instance, in the case of melee, you just get a flat 20% damage increase, so all that's pretty helpful. The other side of this is equipment. Equipment is pretty basic and faction-based, which we'll talk about, but most equipment can provide you various bonus to individual skills, which can certainly be helpful to reach that 120 maximum for any individual ability check, but for the most part, this is going to be dictated by the faction you're working for in terms of your armor. However, things like weapons are mostly just straight upgrades from each other. You'll be able to figure that out pretty easily. And then your amulets and rings and earrings will be things that you can actually adjust on the fly to increase various attributes as you need them to hit a certain threshold. But then we have collections, a returning system from Risen 2, where we can find various objects in the game world that will give us a permanent boost to a skill or attribute. It's definitely worthwhile to find all of these, and because of their existence, it kind of makes min-maxing not super necessary, which is also the case given the non-linear nature of the game that makes it probably, I would say, Piranha Bytes' easiest game to date. But some other cool things in terms of progression is that we see the return of various types of magic, which are more tied into the factions. Part of both that magic system as well as some of the skills we can learn is crafting. If you want to min-max, alchemy is the way to go, because you'll find various herbs throughout the game that can give you, with alchemy, a +5 permanent bonus to your attributes. However, you can just eat the plants for a +2 instead, and while that's always been nice and the case for most of their games, we also see other types of crafting, like being able to forge items, which will actually let you upgrade items as well, which can be a fun way to get some extra damage out of a weapon you particularly enjoy, etc. So the crafting system here is pretty robust, and should not be ignored in terms of progression, but as I said, this game is relatively easy, so min-maxing is not entirely necessary, and I wouldn't worry about it too much. Another part of the progression systems of this game are actually the factions. Much like many of Piranha Bytes games, they push you to join a faction, and while you can do the majority of content in this game without doing so, it will hurt your experience a little bit. Now, if you're trying to min-max and 100% it will likely be what you do, but for most people, I would say join one of the 3 factions as quickly as you can because you'll have a better overall experience. And in this game, we will have to choose between the Guardians, the Demon Hunters, or the Voodoo Pirates. Again, this is mandatory. If you want to complete the game, you will have to pick one of these guys eventually to move the story along. Now, the Guardians are actually your mages. If you want to learn regular old crystal magic from the first game, this is who you will pick. They did add a sort of interesting melee version of magic here as well, though, where you can learn a few spells that you equip as main weapons that your character will then be able to almost sort of punch out magic with, which is honestly a really cool addition. But in addition to this, you'll also get regular spells you can learn like Rain of Fire, things like that. So if you want to play a mage, Guardian's the way to go. And then we have Demon Hunter. This is your more, I would say, martially focused faction. If you want to just be really good at melee, they're the way to go. They use rune magic, most of which focuses on buffing you or dealing damage to the people around you. For the most part, I would focus on the self-buff spells, as you can get some pretty massive bonuses to your melee attack speed as well as damage with the Demon Hunters, and they also have really good armor as well. In addition, they get to replace their dodge with a blink ability, which is just a better version of dodge, which is also pretty nice. And then lastly, we have the Voodoo Pirates. I would say mechanically, these are probably the weakest overall, but they do get some cool spells such as the ability to raise the dead or drain health from enemies, that kind of thing. Whereas the other 2 are more directly like martially focused, or the mages. The Voodoo Pirates are more about support and control, which is useful as we will have a companion with us for basically the entire game, but it's a slightly more indirect way of playing. And while you'll still be able to be very strong just due to the nature of how this game is balanced, I would say it's the least popular choice for a reason. However, outside of dictating your playstyle a little bit, that's not the only thing factions will do for you. You see, you start the game with a small ship, which is a sloop, which isn't very big and not very useful in the fights we have coming to us. So another part of each faction is that you will get a unique ship for each faction that you'll then be able to use, which allows you to take more companions onto your ship, as well as do a variety of other things, such as do all your crafting on your ship instead of having to find a station out in the world. So certainly some nice touches there, and these are all aesthetically different as well, because each faction likes to change small aesthetic things in this game. For instance, each faction we join changes our character in some way. If we join the Guardians, we get a crystal over our eye. If we join the Demon Hunters, our head gets shaved and our dodge gets replaced with blink. If we go the Voodoo Pirate route, we get a bunch of face paint on. And that's before we even start talking about the unique armor and gear that we're going to get for joining each individual faction, alongside some unique talents. Depending on which faction you'll join, you'll get access to the best trainers for that thing. So in the case of the Guardians, the best trainers for magic, or the Demon Hunters will give you the best trainers for martially focused stuff, and while it's not necessary at all, it does help you specialize. Now, outside of that, there's not too much unique content for each individual faction. There are really only the promotional quests. Every faction has an extra rank you can get if you complete a unique quest for them, which is about the only thing content-wise that's really unique outside of the playstyle and aesthetic stuff. So because you get all that extra stuff kind of as soon as you join a faction, I would recommend joining the one you want kind of right away. Because while you can do the majority of the content in this game pretty easily without joining a faction, it is again a worse experience for it. But all of that brings us to the combat section of the game. Combat is much more Risen 2 but expanded than it is Risen 1. Risen 1 is much more of Piranha Bytes' previous experiences with Gothic with a few minor changes. Risen 2 was very different from that, and Risen 3 is kind of Risen 2's combat with a few of the elements of Risen 1 added in, mostly the magic. But it's important to note that right from the beginning of the game, you can always have a companion with you. You'll have up to 7, with one of them being potentially able to leave if your soul rating gets too high. But otherwise, you'll have access to 7 companions, with one of them available right out of the gate, so you'll always have someone accompanying you. And because of this, combat can be much easier than basically all of their other games. But at a base level, we can have either a one-handed melee weapon along with our pistol in the offhand, or we can use things like a musket or have magic equipped. Melee is pretty straightforward, but you get a lot of your basic abilities like the ability to counterattack with your melee weapon via trainers, so that's important stuff to get very quickly, otherwise you're going to find yourself getting knocked out a lot. And the ability to counterattack on a parry, I would say, is probably the most important skill you could get in terms of melee combat. But in terms of ranged, we have pistols and muskets. These are exactly as strong as they were in the previous game. You can increase these stats to increase your damage, of course, but you can have a musket equipped alongside your pistol, and these have separate short cooldowns, which allows you to effectively always be shooting at an enemy. And fully leveled up, it is just as overpowered as it was in Risen 2. But then we have magic. What I did not mention during the magic section is that the types of magic are not necessarily unique to each faction, but what you have available is consumable versions. If you want permanent equipable versions, you need to join that faction and then learn the spell. However, even if you don't join those factions, you can still use those spells through consumable versions, which makes only very few specific things locked behind a faction. For instance, the Guardians still have their equipable main hand sort of melee magic that's unique to them, and then the Demon Hunters have their blink version of dodge that's unique to them. So there are still some minor things that are locked behind factions, but for the most part, if you're willing to put up with the consumable nature of these things, you can still use the magic of all of the other factions, so to speak, but these consumables will scale off of whatever your magical ability is for those things, which means they might be less useful as a result. So something to keep in mind, as pretty much every type of combat we choose to engage with will scale off of the appropriate stats. But while we're on that subject, there are some oddities here. For instance, Risen 3 expands the weapons that are available to you, but in some cases, they did so in a way that doesn't make a ton of sense. For instance, I found a mace or a hammer that was coded as a slashing weapon, so in order to increase my damage with that, I had to increase my slashing weapons skill, despite the fact that it was clearly a hammer. But in item descriptions and things like that, do pay attention to what skill that item is actually scaling off of, and you'll have a better time. But again, the UI is nice enough to actually tell you about this, which is very helpful. However, combat in this game is probably the easiest of all their games simply because of the non-linear nature of this one. Pretty much right away, you can do most of the content in this game as soon as you are revived by bones. And because of this, you can go basically anywhere right from the start of the game. And much of the game, as a result, is scaled around that experience, which means you can sort of quickly get up to speed with combat, and then once you start specializing in something, you get incredibly overpowered very quickly on top of having a companion to distract enemies for you. And because you have all these options and enemies and things like that only ever get so difficult, you can very quickly start just annihilating everything, especially when you start picking up your faction-specific abilities. And as a result, the game does feel like it sort of lacks a challenge once you get over that sort of initial learning curve, especially if this is your first Piranha Bytes game, as their telltale Eurojank aspects of it are always here, but not a difficult game by any means, though all of the options available to you do make it pretty fun, I would say. And the upside of the way this is approached really is that the min-maxing that is always available in their games is not necessary here. For instance, earlier I mentioned that you can use alchemy to permanently increase your attributes, and if you min-max that, you can get pretty much all your attributes maxed out, but it's tedious to do that, and it's also wildly unnecessary. So there's some upsides and some downsides to that approach. But that brings us to the world and gameplay of Risen 3. Ultimately, as I mentioned, we will be sailing around a variety of islands, some of which are returning from Risen 2, and on those islands we can see the aftermath of various events that have taken place since and kind of see how things panned out for those islands, all while we tackle various quests, try to earn our entry into one of the three factions as we combat and fight back the shadows. Luckily, in the settlements, there's a lot of quests with sort of non-combat approaches, which is where things like lockpicking, pickpocket, silver tongue, or intimidate come in. And in that way, I think they did a good job of making all of the quests have a lot of variety in what you're able to do or what you need to do. And in many cases, you'll be running across a lot of recurring characters from the rest of the series, which is nice to get caught up with and see how everyone's doing. But the really nice thing I would say about Risen 3 is that a lot of these locations are very dense in terms of content. There is a lot going on, each area feels pretty packed, and while a few of the islands are relatively small, there is genuinely a lot to do on the 3 major ones, each of which is home to a faction, which can lead to a lot of cool and interesting stuff to see, and I would say that's where this game shines, and it's where I was having a lot of fun with it. There's a ton of quests to find and things like that, but as you explore, you'll also notice little things, such as the environmental storytelling around certain locations or secret areas, but also just in things like enemy placements. For instance, I was multiple times caught off by alligators being positioned just so in the water to not really be visible right away, so I kept just kind of stumbling into them, which is something they did a really good job with. And also, the monster design in general in this game is really cool, and while the game is hardly graphically impressive even at the time it released, a lot of the monsters were really cool to engage with and see, and they do a good job of making you want to explore more of the islands, which I would imagine is why 2 of the islands have sort of locked off areas that require you to progress to a certain point in the story to see, but this does lead to a few occasions where you're kind of hit with video game logic, where there's very clearly a way you could just walk to this place, but you can't because you're not allowed to go there yet, that kind of thing, so it can feel a little video gamey at times. However, methods of traversal that we've seen in previous games, such as the ability to turn into a parrot to cross various gaps and things like that, have been added. We also saw the return of an ability that lets you use a monkey to get into hard-to-reach places, and all of those things come together to make an experience in terms of exploration and the world that's a lot of fun to engage with, which I think is when this game is at its best, provided of course you're willing to put up with the usual bit of jank that accompanies pretty much all of their games. But that does bring us to our DLC section of the video. Risen 3 does come with 3 DLCs that you can either buy individually or with the, I think it's called Gold Edition, though all of these DLCs are pretty minor. One of them just gives you equipment to use called the Adventurer's Garb, which is not necessary at all, and then the other 2 are small extra islands for you to explore, Fog Island as well as the Isle of Thieves. The Isle of Thieves sees us sorting out a problem between goblins and gnomes. This one is interesting because it introduces a few unique mechanics to the quests where a stealth approach is ideal, and while certainly a little silly, it was a fun adventure on the side. And the nice thing about both of these islands actually is that they introduce a lot more of experience and materials to the game. For instance, you can find more of the permanent stat boosting plants you need here on both of the islands, which can dramatically increase your ability to do various things across the game. But the other island, Fog Island, sees us meeting up with an Inquisition outpost that is dealing with the disappearance of a lot of soldiers, which results in several small mysteries that we can solve, and while neither of these DLCs are really revolutionary, they're okay. They add a decent amount to the game, and if you buy them bundled in with the rest of the game, they're not so bad, but none of them I would say are crucial to the experience by any means. And that brings us to our Steam Deck section of the video. Officially, this game has a rating of playable on Steam Deck, and I would pretty much agree with that, with almost all of the problems coming down to the controls themselves. For some reason, the official layout for this game is a just full-on controller, which the Steam Deck has, but that's not actually what Risen 3 uses. Risen 3 only has partial controller support, and on the Steam Deck, this doesn't work at all. So what I had to do was go change the official layout to the keyboard and mouse layout, which will then allow the controls to actually work, but then at that point you have to remap a bunch of keys to get it to work properly. But luckily, that's about the biggest problem you're going to run into, because Risen 3 does support cloud saves, so you can take your save files with you, and this sort of action-adventure isn't so bad on a Steam Deck-like device, which can make it a pretty good experience overall. Provided, of course, you're willing to put in some work to adjust the controls into something playable. But if you can get past that, it's a decent experience on the Steam Deck, with no real problems in terms of graphics, etc., as this is an older game, so the Steam Deck is more than capable of running this thing quite well. That, though, finally does bring us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, I really enjoyed the additions they made to the combat system, especially the Guardian's sort of equipable magic main hand melee spells. Those were very interesting to play around with, but even seeing the return of the regular crystal magic alongside the runes and the things the demon hunters could do really helped the combat system shine a little more, and while this is certainly a janky game overall, I appreciated those additions. And then the other positive is that sort of classic Piranha Bytes formula. It's on full display here in this game, and it is very enjoyable. There's that steady acquisition of power, making decisions about who to side with, how to complete various quests, and while none of it winds up being big in terms of consequences, it's still fun to engage with, even if it's not a mind-blowing experience. Now, on the negative side of things, by far and away, the weak story is really a bit of a mood killer for me, because this is the final entry in a series, and it doesn't feel that way at all. It feels like this game doesn't provide any closure on what's going on with the Titan Lords, what happened to our character from the last two games, and while we can meet that character, we don't really get any answers. And as a conclusion to a series, Risen 3 is a real letdown in terms of the story. And then the other negative is that this game, much like all of Piranha Bytes games, is just full of a lot of jank. The melee combat can feel a little stiff, you're constantly getting knocked down, and as much as I enjoy the expansions to it, the experience as a whole is still incredibly janky, even outside of things like combat, with some of the quest completion markers and things you have to do being a little poorly telegraphed. And lastly, for the negatives, some parts of this just feel very forced. For instance, I didn't really talk about it much because I didn't really need to use it much, but the game added a thing called Astral Vision, which is effectively just a big highlight button, and you can upgrade the Astral Vision over the course of the game to let you see various types of things. And at no point was that system ever really necessary. And then they have things like the soul system, which functions as an almost karma system, but it's only really affected by dialogue choices. For instance, I can go steal and beat up people all day long, but none of that affects your soul rating. So like many of Piranha Bytes games, it lacks a certain amount of polish, let's say, where some of the pieces of it don't fit together quite right. But all of that brings us to our conclusion, finally. My conclusion for Risen 3 is that it is a fun overall RPG, but it's a very unsatisfying conclusion to a series. And while there are things I like about this game and things I don't like about it, as I outlined already, probably the biggest missed mark is that it didn't really wrap up the series that well. But if you're willing to get past that part of it and you're not that invested in the overall story anyway, which is easily done as it kind of varied quite a bit over the entire series, there's a fun RPG at play here with some janky, rough edges that lack a certain amount of polish, which could honestly describe any of Piranha Bytes games. And luckily, for a game that is very cheap, especially on sale, that becomes a much better proposition. Full price, the game is about $20 US. However, I wouldn't recommend paying that because you can regularly find this game on a deep sale, like 90% off. To give an example, I picked it up for like $1.87 on Steam's winter sale, and for a price like that, it can provide you quite a bit of entertainment. Just don't expect a satisfying conclusion to the story, I would say. That is going to do it for me for Risen 3. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.